sun!
It's coming down, move!
Help!
The air in the city of Oakhaven didn't just feel hot. It felt heavy, like the atmosphere was being pressed down by an invisible palm. My parents called it vacation weather, but even at 7 years old, I knew something was wrong. The birds had stopped singing by noon. The stray dogs that usually roamed the cobblestone streets had vanished into the shadows, tails tucked, whimpering at nothing. We were sitting on the balcony of our rental, overlooking a valley that had stood still for 1,000 years. My dad was laughing, pointing out the ancient stone pillars on the horizon. He called them history. I called them teeth. Then the clock struck 3 and the world broke. It wasn't the shaking you see in movies, the rattling of plates or the swaying of chandeliers. It was a sound. A deep, guttural vibration that started in the marrow of my bones and moved outward. It sounded like a giant trying to speak through a throat full of gravel. My father shouted,
Get under the table!
Get under the table, my father screamed, his voice cracking. But I couldn't move. I watched the horizon. Those stone pillars didn't fall. They opened. The earth didn't just crack, it unzipped. Great, jagged fissures tore through the valley floor, glowing not with the orange of magma, but with a sickly, bruised purple light. The earthquake was just the doorbell ringing. The sky, which had been a clear, piercing blue seconds ago, curdled into a bruised gray. High above, the clouds began to swirl into a perfect, terrifying circle, an eye opening in the heavens to watch the slaughter below. Then came the screaming. It wasn't just the people in the streets. The buildings themselves seemed to groan in agony as the foundations were pulled downward. I saw a hotel across the street simply slide into a hole in the pavement, swallowed whole in a matter of seconds. No dust, no debris, just gone. And then they stepped out. They didn't crawl. They didn't scramble. They stepped out of the purple glow with the grace of royalty returning to a lost kingdom. They were impossibly tall, their limbs long and spindly like the legs of a dead spider, draped in robes that looked like they were woven from dried veins. They had no faces, only smooth, crystalline surfaces where features should be, reflecting the terror of the city back at us. One of them looked up toward our balcony. It didn't have eyes, but I felt its gaze pin me to the wall. It raised a hand, and the sound that came out of it wasn't a roar. It was a melody, a beautiful, haunting chant that made my mother drop to her knees and start weeping, not in fear, but in a strange, terrifying kind of worship. Don't look at it, Leo. Look at me, my dad yelled, grabbing my face. But it was too late. The High Lords had arrived, and the Oakhaven we knew was already a ghost. The ground beneath our feet gave way, and as we plunged into the dark, the last thing I saw was the sun being blotted out by a hand that spanned the width of the sky. The holiday was over. The extraction had begun. The plunge into the darkness wasn't a quick fall. It felt like being suspended in thick, cold oil. I remember the sensation of my father's hand slipping away from mine, the last bit of human warmth I would feel for a very long time. When I finally hit the ground, it wasn't stone or dirt. It was soft, like tilled earth, but it smelled of old pennies and wet fur. I sat up, gasping for air that tasted like ozone. Around me, Oakhaven was no longer a city, it was a graveyard of architecture. Buildings had been transplanted into this subterranean void, tilted at impossible angles. Some were fused into the cavern walls as if the earth had simply swallowed them and forgotten to chew. Then the lights flickered on. Not electricity, the High Lords were moving. They glided through the ruins with a terrifying, weightless grace. Up close they were even more wrong. Their skin wasn't skin, it looked like polished bone that had been left in a fire. They didn't speak to each other. They communicated through a series of clicks and low-frequency hums that made the windows of the ruined shops vibrate until they shattered. I hid behind a flipped-over bus, peeking through a cracked window. I saw a group of survivors, maybe 20 people, huddled in the center of what used to be the town square. They were crying, calling out names, reaching for phones that had no signal. One of the High Lords approached them. It didn't attack. It didn't pull out a weapon. It simply stood there, towering 10 feet over them, and began to wave its long, spindly fingers in a rhythmic pattern. It looked like it was weaving the air itself. As it moved, the people stopped crying. Their faces went slack. Their eyes turned a milky white, and they began to walk toward the entity in a single file line. They weren't being forced, they were being harvested. I watched my third-grade teacher walk right past my hiding spot. I whispered her name, but she didn't even blink. She just kept walking into the purple fog, following the hum. This wasn't a war. You only go to war with an equal. This was a collection. I saw my father then. He was at the back of the line. He was fighting it. His hands were shaking and he was biting his lips so hard it bled, trying to stay present. He looked right at the bus where I was hiding. He didn't scream for me to run. He just mouthed one word, "Hide." Then a second entity, smaller but more jagged, noticed the movement. It didn't have the robes of the High Lords. It was a scavenger, a demon with skin like wet leather and too many joints in its arms. It scurried across the ceiling of the cavern, its claws clicking against the stone. I pressed my back against the cold metal of the bus and held my breath until my lungs burned. I heard the scavenger drop onto the roof of the bus. Thud. The metal groaned under its weight. I could hear it sniffing, a wet, rattling sound that seemed to be looking for the scent of fear. I realized then that the High Lords didn't care about me because I was small. To them, I was a stray scrap of meat that had fallen off the table. But the scavenger cared. It was hungry. I watched through the gap in the floorboards as the line of humans disappeared into a massive, pulsing structure at the center of the void. A cathedral made of obsidian and what looked like giant, calcified ribs. Once the last person entered, the High Lords hummed in unison, a sound so loud it knocked me unconscious. When I woke up, the square was empty. My family was gone. The only sound left was the distant, rhythmic thumping of the city's new heart, and the scratching of claws on the other side of the bus. I was 7 years old, and I was the only thing left in Oakhaven that still had a pulse. Hunger is a strange thing. It starts as a pinch in your stomach, but after a few days in the dark, it becomes a screaming voice in your head. I stayed inside that overturned bus for what felt like years, but it was probably only 3 days. I watched the days pass by the pulsing of the purple light in the cavern. When the light dimmed, it was the sleeping cycle. When it flared bright and angry, the things outside were active. I couldn't stay in the bus forever. The scavenger demon had moved on, but I could still hear its claws clicking on the pavement a few blocks away. I crawled out of the back window, my hands shaking. The air was cold, not the refreshing cold of a winter morning, but a stale, dead cold that sucked the heat right out of my skin. The city was a corpse. I walked past a grocery store, but the windows were smashed and the shelves were covered in a thick black slime that moved whenever I got too close. I learned my first lesson then. Don't touch the black slime. I watched a rat scurry across the floor and get stuck in it. The slime didn't just trap the rat. It began to grow over it, pulsing in time with the creature's heartbeat until the rat was gone, replaced by a smooth, black lump. I found my food at the altars. Every few hundred yards, the High Lords had erected these pillars of twisted metal and bone. At the base of these pillars they left things. Sometimes it was a pile of gray, flavorless fruit that looked like it grew in a graveyard. Other times, it was raw meat that didn't come from any animal I recognized. It smelled like copper and old earth. I didn't care. I ate it with my bare hands, crouching in the shadows, my eyes darting back and forth. I became a master of silence. I learned that if I stepped on the balls of my feet and stayed on the patches of moss growing between the cobblestones, the scavengers couldn't hear me. I learned that if I held my breath when the High Lords glided past, they wouldn't notice the hum of my own heart. One night, or what I thought was night, I found a puddle of black rain. I was so thirsty my throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. I leaned down to drink, but as my face got close to the water, I saw my reflection. I didn't recognize the boy staring back. My skin was gray, covered in a layer of soot and ash. My hair was matted with filth. But it was my eyes that scared me. The pupils were wider, darker, taking up almost the whole iris. I was evolving to see in the dark. I heard a sound behind me, a wet, dragging noise. I didn't turn around. I slipped into a narrow gap between two fallen brick walls and pressed myself into the dirt. A scavenger passed by, its long, multi-jointed neck sniffing the air right where I had been standing. It let out a low, clicking sound. Without thinking, I clicked back. It was a tiny sound, a dry snap of my tongue against the roof of my mouth. The demon froze. It tilted its head, its pale, sightless face turning toward my hiding spot. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would break them. The demon waited. I waited. For 10 minutes, neither of us moved. Then, the demon chattered its teeth and moved on, seemingly satisfied that the sound was just an echo of itself. That was the moment everything changed. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was learning the language of the monsters. I realized that if I wanted to live, I couldn't just hide from the shadows. I had to become one of them. I began to smear the black ash from the fissures onto my arms and face. I stopped standing up straight, finding it easier to move on all fours, staying low to the ground where the shadows were thickest. I was no longer Leo, the boy on holiday. I was the scavenger of the ruins. The first cycle was over. The human in me was beginning to starve to death, and something else was waking up. Survival in the deep city wasn't about strength. It was about camouflage. By the third year, the memory of my mother's perfume and the taste of clean water felt like dreams I'd had in a different life. My body had changed. I was leaner, my muscles corded like wire, and I moved with a silent, hitching gait that felt more natural than walking. But the ash wasn't enough anymore. The scavengers were getting smarter, or maybe they were just getting hungrier. I spent weeks watching them from the rafters of a collapsed library. I realized the demons didn't just recognize each other by smell, they recognized the shape. They moved in a disjointed, rhythmic way, their limbs snapping into place with every step. If I wanted to move freely, I had to stop looking like a human boy and start looking like a broken thing. I found a dead scavenger near the edge of a fissure. It had been crushed by falling debris, its leathery skin torn open to reveal muscles like black string. With a piece of sharpened glass and a stomach turned to iron, I did what I had to do. I didn't just take its skin, I studied how it was put together. I fashioned a cloak from its hide, stitching the cold, rubbery flesh to my own clothes using dried tendons I'd scavenged from the altars. When I put it on, the smell was overpowering, a mix of sulfur and rot, but it worked. It dampened the heat of my body, made me smell like the void. Next came the movement. I practiced in the basement of a ruined bakery. I spent hours in front of a cracked mirror, learning how to dislocate my shoulders and crawl on my knuckles. I learned to tilt my head at that sharp, avian angle they all used. I practiced the click until I could mimic the sound of a lesser demon calling for its mate. The first test was the hardest. I was crossing the main thoroughfare of the ruined city when a pack of 3 howlers, creatures with no eyes and mouths that took up half their chests, came sprinting around the corner. In the past, I would have bolted for the nearest drain. This time I forced myself to stay. I dropped to my knuckles. I arched my back until my spine felt like it would snap, letting the scavenger hide drape over me. As they got closer, I didn't hide. I stepped into their path. The lead howler skidded to a halt, its chest mouth heaving as it tasted the air. It was 3 feet away. I could see the translucent parasites crawling under its skin. I didn't breathe. I let out a low, wet clicking sound followed by a sharp hiss. I jerked my head to the left, snapping my jaw shut. The howlers circled me. They sniffed at the scavenger hide. One of them let out a mournful low hum, its massive head hovering inches from my own face. I didn't flinch. I mirrored its movement, swaying my body in time with its breathing. After an eternity, the lead creature chattered its teeth and leaped over me, the rest of the pack following. They didn't see a boy. They saw a small, deformed scavenger too pathetic to eat. I stood there for a long time after they left, my heart finally beginning to thud against my ribs. I had passed. I was a ghost in a skin suit. But the mimicry went deeper than skin and bone. I began to realize that the more I acted like them, the more I understood the frequency of the city. I started to hear the music in the High Lord's hums. It wasn't just noise, it was math. It was instructions. They were building something out of the ruined city, turning the skyscrapers into tuning forks to pull more of their world into ours. I found myself drawn to the fissures. I would sit on the edge of the purple pits for hours, watching the way the light danced. Sometimes I would catch myself whispering back to the hums in a language I hadn't learned but somehow knew. My thoughts were no longer in English. They were in shapes, in hunger, in the cold logic of the nameless. I was no longer pretending to be a monster to survive. The mimicry was becoming a transformation. I wasn't the boy who lost his family anymore. I was a new species, a bridge between the living and the eternal dark. And for the first time since the earthquake, I wasn't afraid. I was curious. By the 5th year, I had stopped counting days. Time in the deep city didn't move in a straight line. It moved in pulses. I had become so good at the mimicry that I didn't just look like a scavenger, I felt like one. My sense of smell had sharpened to the point where I could tell the difference between the scent of ancient dust and the metallic tang of an approaching High Lord from miles away. But something shifted during what I call the Great Flare. The purple light from the fissures stayed bright for a long time, and the air grew thick with a scent like burning sugar. The monsters were restless. I was scavenging near the outskirts of the Cathedral of Ribs, looking for scraps of the gray fruit, when I ran into a lesser demon. This wasn't one of the mindless howlers or the spindly scavengers. This was something else, a guardian. It stood 7 feet tall, with a body that looked like it was made of translucent obsidian. You could see its internal organs pulsing with that same bruised purple light. Usually when I saw a guardian, I would melt into the shadows and wait for hours. But this time I was trapped. I had crawled into a narrow stone pipe to find a cache of food, and when I backed out, it was standing right there. It didn't roar. It didn't strike. It just looked at me. I did what I always did. I dropped to my knuckles, arched my back, and let out that dry, hollow click. I hissed and tilted my head, trying to show it that I was just a pathetic, deformed thing not worth the effort of killing. The guardian didn't move. It tilted its head in perfect synchronization with mine. I panicked. I tried a different sound, a low, mournful moan I'd heard the scavengers use when they were injured. The guardian mimicked that too. It was mocking me. Or worse, it was studying me. Then it did something that shattered my heart. It reached out a long 3-fingered hand and touched the cloak of demon skin I had stitched to my shoulders. With a single, effortless tug, it ripped the hide away. I was left standing there in my tattered, filth-covered human clothes, my pale, gray skin exposed to the cold air. I was certain I was dead. I closed my eyes, waiting for the claws to tear through my throat. But the blow never came. Instead, I felt something cold and heavy drop at my feet. I opened my eyes. The guardian had reached into a pouch at its side and pulled out a slab of raw, glowing meat, the kind of food only the High Lords were allowed to touch. It was humming, a sound so low it made my teeth ache. It wasn't a growl of anger. It was a sound of recognition. The guardian reached out again, but this time it didn't use its claws. It placed a heavy, flat palm on top of my head, much like my father used to do. The touch was freezing, like ice against my scalp, but the intent was unmistakable. It wasn't seeing me as a human. It wasn't seeing me as a scavenger. It was seeing me as a pet, a curiosity, a creature that had survived the impossible and deserved to be kept. It let out a sharp, rhythmic series of clicks, a command. It pointed toward the Cathedral of Ribs, wanted me to follow. For the first time, I wasn't hiding in the shadows of the ruins. I was walking in the footsteps of a god. As we walked, the other demons, the howlers and the scavengers, parted like a dark sea. They didn't growl at me. They lowered their heads as we passed. I realized then that the mimicry had worked too well. I had spent years trying to convince them I was one of them, and I had finally succeeded. But the price was higher than I imagined. By accepting that meat, by following that guardian, I was officially leaving the world of men behind. When we reached the gates of the cathedral, the guardian stopped and looked back at me. Its featureless face reflected my own distorted image. I picked up the glowing meat and took a bite. It tasted like lightning and ash. I wasn't Leo anymore. I was a guest of the Nameless, and the deep city was finally opening its black heart to me. The transition from the ruined streets to the interior of the cathedral was like stepping inside a living lung. It didn't feel like a building made of stone. It felt like a building made of consequence. The walls were lined with calcified ribs that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic thud, and the air was thick with the smell of old incense mixed with decaying meat. This was the Cathedral of Rot, the throne room of the things that had stolen my world. As the guardian led me deeper, I saw what had become of the harvest. The humans who had been taken during the earthquake weren't dead. They were part of the architecture. I saw people I recognized from the village. The baker, the woman who sold flowers, fused into the walls by a thick amber-colored resin. They were alive, their eyes moving frantically, but their bodies had been reshaped into pillars and decorative friezes. They were living tapestries, their nervous systems being used as a sort of biological wiring for the city. I wanted to scream, to tear them down, but the guardian's cold hand stayed on my shoulder. I realized then why I was special. I wasn't fused to a wall because I had chosen to move like the Nameless. I had earned my legs. We reached the central chamber, a space so vast that a skyscraper could have stood inside it without touching the ceiling. In the center sat the High Lords, not just the tall ones I'd seen in the streets, but the elders. They were motionless, seated on thrones of obsidian, their long limbs draped like weeping willow branches. They weren't eating or talking. They were dreaming. The hum in this room was so loud it felt like physical weight. It was the sound of 1,000 voices screaming in a frequency too low for the human ear to hear, but perfect for the soul to feel. I stood in the center of that chamber, a tiny gray-skinned boy in the middle of a divine nightmare. One of the elders leaned forward. It didn't have a face, but as it moved, the amber resin on the walls began to glow. It reached out a finger, a needle-thin shard of bone, and touched the center of my forehead. I didn't see my life flash before my eyes. I saw theirs. I saw the beginning of the universe, where these entities were the first thoughts of a cold god. I saw them being cast out, forced into the deep places of the earth to wait for the stars to align. I saw that the earthquake wasn't an attack, it was a homecoming. They weren't monsters in their own eyes, they were the rightful owners of the world, and we were just the weeds that had grown in their garden while they slept. The elder withdrew its finger. I fell to my knees, vomiting that glowing meat I'd eaten earlier. My head felt like it was splitting open, filled with geometries and languages that no human brain was meant to hold. But I didn't die. I stood up. The elder let out a sound, a soft, vibrating chime. The guardian stepped back. I was no longer a pet. By surviving the touch of an elder, I had been baptized in their rot. I was allowed to roam the cathedral. I was allowed to see the deep city for what it truly was. A machine designed to turn human suffering into the fuel they needed to rise back to the surface. I spent years in that cathedral, wandering the halls of living flesh. I stopped feeling pity for the people in the walls. I started seeing them as they did, as materials. As I walked, the ribs would part for me. The black slime would retreat from my path. I was the only thing in that entire subterranean hell that had a heartbeat and a choice. I was the Prince of Rot, the human who had looked into the void and found that the void was hungry for a friend. The silence of the deep city was never truly silent. It was a thick, rhythmic thrumming of breathing walls and clicking gods. But after 14 years, that silence was shattered by a sound that didn't belong. It was a harsh, mechanical grinding, the sound of metal screaming against stone. I was perched on a ledge of calcified bone, high up in the ribs of the cathedral, when the first drill bit broke through the ceiling. It looked pathetic. A spinning, silver needle of human technology piercing the sacred dark. Then came the explosions. The Sun People had arrived. They didn't come with prayers or offerings. They came with high-intensity floodlights and sonic cannons. To me, the light was physical pain. My eyes, which had spent over a decade adjusting to the soft, bruised purple of the fissures, felt like they were being melted in their sockets. I hissed, a sound I didn't even realize was inhuman, and scrambled deeper into the shadows of the living walls. The soldiers came down on thick steel cables. They wore sleek, black tactical gear and helmets with glowing blue visors. They looked like ants invading a hive. Through the communication speakers on their suits, I heard the first human voices I'd encountered in 14 years. Target sector reached. Atmospheric readings are off the charts. We have visual on the, oh God, are those people in the walls? I watched from the rafters, my body coiled like a spring. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel like I was being rescued. I felt a hot, bubbling rage. This was my home. These were my masters. The soldiers began to move through the cathedral, their heavy boots crunching on the delicate bone moss. They were clumsy. They were loud. One of the soldiers stopped near a tapestry of fused humans. He reached out a gloved hand to touch the amber resin. Base, we have survivors. They're integrated into the structure, requesting immediate extraction tools. As soon as his hand touched the wall, the cathedral reacted. The hum of the room changed from a lullaby to a death rattle. The High Lords didn't even need to move. The shadows themselves simply reached out. From the dark corners of the ceiling, a pack of howlers dropped like stones. The soldiers opened fire. The sound was deafening, the rat-tat-tat of machine guns tearing through the ancient air. I saw a howler's head explode in a spray of black ichor, and for a second, I felt a pang of genuine grief. Contact. Contact. We have hostiles. Fire at will. It was a slaughter, but not the kind the soldiers expected. Their bullets killed the smaller demons, but the High Lords were different. One of the elders rose from its throne. It didn't run. It just stood there and let out a frequency so sharp that the glass visors on the soldiers' helmets shattered instantly. I saw men screaming, clutching their bleeding eyes, stumbling into the black slime that waited on the floor. I watched as the floor opened up and swallowed a soldier whole, his screams cut short by the wet snap of closing stone. Then a stray flare landed right beneath my ledge. The white light exposed me. I was crouching on all fours, my skin the color of a corpse, my long matted hair hanging over a face that no longer looked like a boy's. One of the surviving soldiers pointed his rifle at me, his hands shaking. "What is that? Is that a kid? Base, I've got a civilian. He's moving like one of them." He stepped toward me, his flashlight blinding me. "Son, can you hear me? We're here to take you home." "Home?" I whispered. The word felt like a mouthful of broken glass. I hadn't used my vocal cords for English in a decade. I didn't walk to him. I leaped. I didn't mean to hurt him, but my body moved on instinct, the instinct of a scavenger protecting its nest. I landed on his chest, my weight knocking the air out of him. I hissed into his face, my black pupils taking up his entire field of vision. He didn't see a boy. He saw a monster. He screamed and swung his rifle, the butt of the gun catching me in the temple. The world went white. The last thing I heard before the darkness took me was the sound of a heavy metal cage slamming shut and the mechanical roar of a winch pulling me toward the surface, away from the only world I understood. The ascent was a slow, mechanical torture. Every foot the winch pulled the steel cage upward felt like a limb being torn from my body. The pressure in my ears didn't just pop, it screamed. The air was becoming thin, losing the thick, comforting weight of the deep city's breath. I wasn't sitting in the cage. I was huddled in the corner, my spine curved in that unnatural arch I'd perfected over 14 years. My fingers, tipped with claws I'd grown from scratching at stone, gripped the cold bars so hard the metal groaned. "Easy there, kid. You're safe now," a voice crackled from a speaker. I didn't know what safe meant. Safe was the shadow. Safe was the hum of the elders. This metal box, this vibrating wire, this was the trap. When the cage finally cleared the surface, the sun people were waiting. The sun wasn't a warm friend, it was a white-hot blade that sliced into my retinas. I let out a sound, a long rattling screech that I'd learned from the howlers, and threw myself against the bars. I heard men shout and scramble back. "Don't open it yet. Look at his eyes, he's completely dilated. Get the sedative." I watched them through the slits of my fingers. They were wearing white suits now like ghosts. They looked fragile. I could see the pulse in their necks, and my jaw ached with a hunger I didn't recognize. To them, I was a victim. To me, they were soft, loud, and smelled of artificial soap and fear. A woman approached the cage. She wasn't holding a gun, she was holding a needle. Her face was covered by a plastic shield, but I could see her eyes. They were wet. She was looking at me with pity. That was the greatest insult of all. She didn't understand that I had outlived gods while her kind was still playing with fire. "Leo, can you hear me? You're back in Oakhaven. Or what's left of it. We've been looking for survivors for a decade." I didn't answer. I leaned my face against the bars and produced a series of rapid, dry clicks. I was calling for the Guardian. I was calling for the elder who had touched my forehead. I was waiting for the ground to open up and reclaim me. But the ground stayed silent. "He's nonverbal," she whispered to someone behind her. "Likely severe psychological regression. He's mimicking the entities to process the trauma." They didn't realize it wasn't a choice. It was my skin. It was my blood. When the needle hit my arm, I didn't fight it like a human would. I didn't swing my fists. I coiled my body and hissed, my black pupils fixated on her throat until the chemical shadow took me. I woke up in a room that was too white and too quiet. I was strapped to a bed with thick leather restraints. They had scrubbed the ash from my skin, leaving me raw and shivering. They had cut my hair. They had tried to wash the deep city off me, but they couldn't reach my mind. I lay there, staring at the fluorescent lights on the ceiling. They flickered at a frequency of 60 hertz. It was a pathetic, shallow rhythm compared to the heartbeat of the cathedral. I began to hum, a low, vibrating tone that mirrored the elder's chant. The heart rate monitor beside my bed began to glitch. The screen distorted, the green line forming the shape of an obsidian rib. A nurse walked in, checking her clipboard. She didn't notice that the shadows in the corners of the room were starting to stretch toward the bed, moving even though the light hadn't changed. She didn't notice that my shadow on the wall had 4 arms instead of 2. "Time for your meds, Leo," she said, her voice bright and hollow. I looked at her, and for the first time I smiled. It wasn't a human smile. My jaw opened wider than it should have, the joints clicking in the silence of the ward. "I'm not Leo," I whispered, the English words sounding like a dead language. The rescue was their mistake. They thought they had brought a survivor back to the world of light. They didn't realize they had just invited the dark inside. The psychiatric facility at Blackwood Heights was designed to be a fortress of logic, a place where the broken are mended by white walls and structured routines. But logic has no power over a mind that has been rewritten by the Nameless. I sat in the center of my room day after day, refusing the chair and the bed. I sat on the floor, my legs tucked beneath me in a way that would have snapped a human's tendons. The doctors called it catatonia. They thought I was gone. They didn't realize I was listening. The hospital had a rhythm, the hum of the air conditioning, the buzzing of the lights, the distant chatter of the night shift. It was a weak, thin symphony. I began to change it. I spent my nights humming. It wasn't a loud sound, it was a vibration that traveled through the floorboards and into the plumbing. I was a tuning fork for the deep city. Every time I hummed, the frequency of the building shifted. The light bulbs started to burn out, leaving long stretches of the hallway in a bruised, purple-tinted darkness. The water in the sinks began to taste of copper and old earth. Then the symptoms started appearing in the others. The nurse who gave me my medication stopped blinking. I watched her during the 2 a.m. rounds. She stood at my door for 10 minutes, her eyes wide and milky white, staring at nothing. She wasn't afraid. She was waiting. "The light is too loud, Leo," she whispered one night, her voice sounding like dry leaves. I didn't answer. I just clicked my tongue against the roof of my mouth. She clicked back. By the second month, the facility was no longer a hospital. It was a nursery. The patients in the ward weren't screaming anymore. They were silent, sitting in their rooms, moving their fingers in rhythmic, weaving patterns, just like the High Lords I had watched for 14 years. They were weaving the air, pulling threads of the void into the world of the sun. The doctors were the last to know. They stayed in their glass-walled offices, writing reports about mass psychogenic illness and environmental toxins. They didn't notice that the shadows in the hospital were no longer attached to the people walking by. They didn't notice that the cracks in the basement floor were beginning to glow with a familiar, sickly purple light. The final night came when the head psychiatrist, a man who prided himself on his rational mind, walked into my room. He looked tired. His tie was loose and his eyes were bloodshot. "We're moving you to a higher security wing, Leo," he said, reaching for his clipboard. "The influence you have on the other patients, it's not something we can explain yet." I stood up. I didn't use my hands. I simply rose, my spine uncoiling like a serpent. I walked toward him, not with a human stride, but with that hitching, disjointed grace. I stopped inches from his face. I could smell the coffee on his breath, the sweat on his skin. He was so soft, so temporary. "You didn't rescue me," I said, my voice vibrating in his chest. "You opened the door." I looked past him into the hallway. The lights flickered once and died. In the darkness, I saw them. The nurse, the orderlies, the other patients, they were all standing in the hall, their eyes glowing with a faint, white light. And behind them, stepping out of the shadows of the janitor's closet, was a silhouette that was 10 feet tall, spindly, and faceless. The earthquake in Oak Haven had been a collection. This was an infection. I walked out of my room and into the hallway. The High Lord bowed its head as I passed, its long bone-white fingers touching the floor. I wasn't the boy in the cage anymore. I was the scout. I was the bridge. As we walked toward the exit, the ground beneath the hospital began to moan. A deep, guttural vibration started in the marrow of the earth and moved outward. It sounded like a giant trying to speak through a throat full of gravel. The sun was coming up over the horizon, but for the first time in 14 years, I didn't squint. I didn't hide. I watched as the sky began to curdle into a bruised gray, and a perfect, terrifying circle of clouds began to swirl over the city. The holiday was over. The world was finally going to meet the Nameless.